let me announce we have Professor Kevin Crowston as our session keynote. Then for anchor, we have Dr. Madhan Muthu. And for panelists on we have Dr. Medha Joshi, Dr. Shaily Gandhi, and Dr. Biswanath Dutta. So I request all the speakers to proceed to the DS.
Very good evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity. In this particular session, we are going to focus more on data governance, data sharing, and reuse. From this morning, since this morning, I have been attending almost all the sessions, and I see a lot of overlap will be there, because that is a natural aspect of this particular topic. Exactly 10 years ago, I read a report prepared by Royal Society of Science, the Science as an Open Enterprise. When I read the report, almost what we are discussing from this morning was discussed, you can see that in that report. Almost all aspects covered. Exactly the words that we use to define this area and making open data possible, all that were there in that report. But I was so negative that time that in India it will take long time to have such discussions on open data, or people will take long time here. But surprisingly, within a few years, I started noticing that open science has been a keyword that is being discussed across the meetings for many years. And today I think it is a very happy occasion for me to see that this has already become a mainstream. That's what Professor was saying. This topic has become already a mainstream. So today, this particular session we are going to focus about data governance and particularly data sharing and reuse. That aspect for this session, I think we have a keynote speaker from, he's a professor of Syracuse University. And we have three distinguished panelists, Dr. Medha Joshi. She's a consultant, information services, National Cancer Grid. And we have Dr. Shaily Gandhi from CEPT University, Ahmedabad. And we have Dr. Biswanath Dutta from DRTC, Bangalore. May I request Professor Kevin Crowston to deliver his keynote address? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to all of the organizers and everyone who put in the hard work to make this happen and to get me here from literally the other side of the world. I wanted to give a talk based on my own experiences, and my closest connection with research data management is the time I spent working on the Day2 project, which is the large cyber infrastructure project. So it touches on two of the three themes. Yes, of course, please. It touches on two of the main themes, so data sharing and data reuse. I'm afraid I do not have a lot to say about data governance, but I'm sure that will be filled in by the panelists. So Day2 was a 10-year cyber infrastructure development project. It was funded by the US National Science Foundation, tens of millions of dollars through 2 cooperative agreements. And I should emphasize actually that I am not at all a leader of this project. I'm merely one of the many, many people who worked on it. You can actually see a picture on the left of the number of people who worked on this project at one of the meetings we had. And I think, I'm sort of in the back row somewhere, so clearly not the leader of this, this event. But I did spend a long time working on it, and it did give me some insights into the issues around data sharing and reuse that I'd like to share. So the goal of Day2, the vision was to provide universal access to data about life on Earth and the environment that sustains it, as well as the tools needed by researchers. So it was really very much oriented around data sharing and data reuse with a specific focus on ecological data. So part of that was building a community, this group of people who were going to deliver this vision, but also the ones who are going to use it. And then the part that I want to focus on is in the middle, a sustainable data discovery and interoperability solution, as well as supporting various kinds of researcher tools. And the project was set up to address 4 problems. These were the problems that were initially identified when the project started in 2009, I think it was. And one is one that people have mentioned several times today, which is this problem of dispersed sources. The data are very massive. There's a lot of data, and they're really, really spread out. And so at the time, this is focusing on the US, I apologize. It's a very, very US focus, but it was a US funded project. It was noted that there are hundreds of field stations and research centers that are collecting this data, as well as natural history museums and other places that are gathering data together. And as well, in the US, there are many government agencies that collect data, which I think is true here in India as well. So you had the problem of accessing all of these. And of course, individual scientists were also creating as well as using data. And so all in all, thousands and thousands of different places where the data could be found. The data were also extremely heterogeneous, which is a characteristic of ecology data. And yet there was this desire to be able to draw conclusions that drew across multiple data sets. So really bringing the data together. And there were these fairly sophisticated ideas about how that might work, where you could merge things together. A third was addressing the poor practice of data management, which is a theme that has come up many times in many different people's talks. This was a slide put together by the project PI, pointing out that there was this problem of data entropy, that the data had a lot of value and information content at the time they were collected, but over time, people would forget the details. They might have an accident and lose the data, which I'll talk about in a sec. But eventually, of course, they would retire and take all of the knowledge about that data with them to their retirement or eventually to their death. And of course, there were lots of challenges where the data could simply get lost, especially being so spread out. In many cases, this was what's known as under-the-desk data. I think that was referred to in an earlier talk, things that are on people's own computers or on some kind of magnetic medium in a drawer someplace, and so very susceptible to loss. So what Data1 set out to do was to create what they called a one-stop shop for data. And it was observed that there was actually quite a lot of data out there, but it was scattered across all of these different repositories, which meant that a researcher who wanted data would be making individual queries against those repositories, looking for answers. They would perhaps find data in 1 or 2 of the places, but then they would face the challenge of actually retrieving each data set individually and making sense of it, which made our researcher up in the corner there very sad. So Data1 set out to address this by creating this federation. So the idea was that it would not replace the repositories, but rather provide a front end to them, so that you could go to Data1, you could do a search. Data1 would help you find the data in all the different repositories and return some kind of an integrated package to the researcher, or at least that was the vision, and thus be a vehicle for promoting this reuse of data. And even better, as new repositories came up, they could join the federation, and so that same search that the researcher had done would now retrieve data from this increasingly large number of repositories. In order to make this happen, there was a number of things that had to be created. One key point was that Data1 was not going to replace the repositories. So the existing domain repositories would still be there. And those were what were referred to as member nodes. So these repositories with the data would join Data1. What Data1 was going to provide was a set of coordinating nodes. So initially there were 3 of them. There was a vision that eventually, those 3 were all in the US, there was a vision that there'd be more coordinating nodes in different parts of the world so that researchers anywhere in the world would have a local coordinating node they could go to. There was also going to be an investigator's toolkit, which I'll talk about in a bit. It's also worth pointing out that there was a notion that the coordination nodes could enable replication so that different repositories could actually copy data from each other and thus address the 4th problem about data loss. And to make this work, there were some very interesting challenges, but again, this really emphasizes the importance of machine-readable metadata, because the only way that this could work was for the coordinating nodes to talk to all the member nodes, and you see a list of some of the initial member nodes down the side, things like LTER, Long-Term Ecological Research Network, or the US GS had a repository. Each of those had metadata about the data sets that they contained, and the idea was that the coordinating nodes would harvest that metadata, translate it into a common format. So that's a key point. It can only do the translation if you understand the metadata format, and then make that available to some kind of a search engine. So it started off fairly small with a handful of repositories. It's still running today under a slightly different status, and in fact has 44 repositories joined up, and every once in a while another one comes online. So it really did achieve that vision. And if you were to go to it today, you would see something that looks rather like this, modeled, as you can imagine, on the Google search engine, where you can type in some kind of a query about what you're looking for. You can also do an advanced search thanks to the metadata. And you can also just browse. So just to get a sense of what's in there, I browsed for data sets around the Mumbai region. And you can see that there are, you know, let's see, what does it say? Almost 4,000 data sets covering a fairly wide area. And were you to click on one of those, you actually get the record, and you can get the metadata directly because Data 1 has harvested that. But in fact, actually, if you want the data set itself, it just gives you a pointer to the repository that contains that. So in terms of supporting reuse, there were some strong points. I should acknowledge that the slides I've shown you up until now actually come from Data 1. So they're part of Data 1's reporting about itself, so pretty authoritative about what they thought about themselves. So some of the interesting points about the project technically are that it's creating this federated structure. There's some interesting technical problems in creating a metadatabase and keeping it up to date. It also gave them the possibility, as I mentioned, to offer services like replication. But another really interesting thing about it is that in addition to creating cyber infrastructure, it was also doing basic and applied research, and that was carried out through a set of what were called working groups, so a set of topical working groups. So the whole Data 1 organization at the end looked like this, with an external advisory board and the principal investigator and an executive director at the top. And then in the middle, some project leads. Over on the left, there's the group that's actually developing the cyber infrastructure, some developers at that middle level, as well as the people running the coordinating nodes. And then at the bottom in green are the different working groups. And it's probably a little bit too small to read, but it includes things on the technical side like provenance, semantics, and integration, that with the people who are going to work on getting the data sets to merge together. And then on the right, groups like community engagement, citizen science, sociocultural barriers, long-term sustainability. So that was me all the way on the bottom on the right, so not near the top, at the bottom. I was initially part of the sociocultural barriers group, and then later the usability and assessment group. So we had this interesting charge in sociocultural. We were to work out all of the reasons why scientists might not want to use the cyber infrastructure that had been developed. But there was actually a lot of other engagement with the community. Again, I think that was a strong point of the project. There were enough people that you could actually have fairly robust community assessment. So that included a bunch of things over the years. So a lot of usability testing, taking the interface, sitting people in front of it with eye trackers. That led to a lot of improvements in the usability of the project. A bunch of stakeholder surveys, I'll talk about some of those. Personas and scenario development, I'll mention those briefly as well. And all of that was helping to support the cyber infrastructure development. So for example, one of the initial tasks was just figuring out who the stakeholders were for Data 1, who was going to be impacted by this project. Of course, the scientists were in the middle, but scientists come from different settings and have different partners. You'll notice that libraries show up here many, many times, because basically in each of these settings, there are different kinds of libraries, and it was a sense of the project that the librarians were going to be really key in making some of these things happen. I want to mention the personas because that was actually one of the things that I worked on for a fair time. The idea here was to take each one of those stakeholders and to develop what's known as a persona. So a persona is actually a written description of a particular role. But the thing which makes them maybe a little bit unique is that you actually give the persona a name. So this was a particular kind of ecologist who we thought might want to use Day2, but we named her Sun. It actually includes a picture of Sun so that you can put a face to the name. It has a fair description of what life is like for this kind of a person. And the goal is to go from this somewhat dry description of the stakeholders to really bring the person alive, so that when the developers are thinking about developing software, it's not what will a scientist do with this, but is this going to help Sun? And how is it going to help Sun exactly? In particular with Sun, there was the sense that it would take her from actually a fairly sophisticated user of data, who's actually collecting the data and actually capable of creating metadata, already doing deposit, and incorporate her into this broader life cycle of data where the data are not only being deposited, but they're going into some kind of repository where other people are using it, and where she in turn is able to access data and bring it in. So there was quite a lot of thinking about how people were going to use this. Another real strength was a lot of attention to education and training, with the realization that data sharing and data reuse are not really natural behaviors to a lot of people, and that data management was something that really needed to be taught. So Day2 actually did develop quite a lot of training resources which are still available. And in fact, one of their current business models is providing training so that you can actually take courses that Day2 sponsors. And in fact, I drew on some of those in the workshop I gave yesterday. There was also identification of best practices. There's a fairly extensive database of best practices, as well as identification of software tools, which is that investigator toolkit I mentioned. So there was sort of a mapping into the data lifecycle of all the different kinds of tools that would be available to support researchers in those stages. Day2 also contributed to the data management planning tool. That's been mentioned several times by different people. But that was, again, something to try to make data management a little bit more easy. I mentioned that one of the things that we were interested in was these motivations and barriers, because pretty early on it was realized that sort of a key to having a useful system is having scientists actually deposit data. And so the assumption was that what was holding things back was whether people would be willing to share data. And so that led to a set of surveys looking at basically surveying scientists, mostly in ecology, since that was the focus, asking them about their data sharing, but also about the different reasons why they shared data, why they didn't share data, how much of their data they shared, and so on. There are actually 3 of those. The project, as I said, lasted 10 years, so there was one near the beginning, one sort of in the middle, one towards the end. So we actually have this nice longitudinal data. There's actually a paper which is, I think, currently under review, assessing how attitudes about data sharing had changed over the decade. And maybe the good news is over on the left, which again might be a little bit too small to see, but it's people's answers to the question, I would be willing to share data across a broad group of researchers. So not just with people in my own research group or my own institution, but I'd be willing to share data broadly. And towards the top, it's environmental scientists or ecology, and it's like 90-something% saying that they would do it. Now, of course, that number might be a little bit inflated, because if you get sent a survey about data sharing and reuse and you aren't interested in it at all, then perhaps you won't answer. But at least it does suggest that there is a fair population of people for whom data sharing seems reasonable. And it also confirms a lot of what people have already said about why people don't share data. So number 1 on the list down here on the left, if part of your data are not available to others, why not? I need to publish them first, about 30-something%. There's not enough time to make them available. I don't have the rights, I don't have money, I'm not required to do it. But an interesting one, sort of in the middle there, is people don't need them. I'm not sharing my data because, who needs my data? And also, there is no place to put them. That was sort of an interesting one. Another thing, though, that the surveys revealed is that good data practices are still pretty rare. So for example, when asked where do you deposit your data, only about a sixth mentioned some kind of a repository, either a discipline-based repository or an institution's repository. So 1 in 6 are actually depositing their data in a repository. About another half have it on some kind of a server, on the cloud, on an institutional server, or departmental server of some sort. And a surprisingly large number, 2/3, have it on their own personal computer, and a astonishing 30% have it on a thumb drive. So places which may or may not be backed up, may or may not be robust. So really susceptible to data loss. There was also very low use of metadata. The most common answer to what kind of metadata to use is none. Number 3 and 4 on the list are metadata standardized within my lab or within my institution, and a very, very small number reporting the use of actual metadata standards. So these did spur some motion. So for example, there's this notion that there's a lot of orphan data which are not really fitting into the specialized repositories, and they're fairly small in volume, but they're very large in number. So there's just a lot of them. And to try to capture those, Day2 actually created its own repository, which was sort of a catch-all. So if you couldn't find a disciplinary repository, you could use a very simple program that would take basically an Excel spreadsheet and upload it, capture the metadata, put it into the repository. And that was later merged into a system called UC-, which is another approach. So again, trying to minimize the barriers to sharing by saying, it's easy, you can just take a spreadsheet, you can upload it, and we have a place for it to go. Interestingly, it was fairly late in the project before there was much attention to data reuse. There had always been this assumption that our researcher was out there, anxious to get data, and what was hindering that was just the knowledge of where to look for it. So a little bit towards the end of the project, surprisingly, people started to ask, well, so data reuse, are people actually, who's interested in data reuse, and how do we get them interested in data reuse? So again, from the survey, and again, these are probably biased numbers because there are people who took the time to fill out a survey about data sharing and data reuse. About a third of the people, and again, I'm apologizing, the font is a little bit hard to read, but the blue and the orange on the top right are never or seldom. So about a third of the people don't reuse data. The gray is about 30% who occasionally reuse data, and only about a third frequently or always reuse data. So again, data reuse was not uncommon, but not necessarily the norm either. Furthermore, from the survey, we discovered that reuse and sharing are only weakly correlated. So basically, it's not that there are people who frequently share and reuse, but rather some people share, other people reuse. And that actually poses quite a lot of difficulties in motivating either group because you basically have a situation where the sharers are having to do this extra work, spend extra time, spend extra money, but it's other people who may be getting the benefits of that sharing. And so that kind of a situation is tricky for getting the motivations right and getting the incentives right. Some of my colleagues and I, actually a former student, Renata Curti, was the lead on this. She in fact wrote her dissertation about data reuse and has done some nice work about that. We actually reused the survey data to write a paper about reuse, and we had hypothesized 3 attitudes and 5 subjective norms that we thought would impact reuse. So belief that reuse is more efficient or more effective, we thought would positively influence reuse, but concerns about trustworthiness we thought would negatively impact. So if you don't think the data are trustworthy, you're not going to want to reuse them. And then subjective norms, the question in particular was, there are norms in my discipline against reusing data. So obviously if you think that, you're probably unlikely to reuse, so that's a negative impact. But also importance. Reusing data is important. That would be a positive impact. And interestingly, for 4 out of the 5, the data confirmed that. So people who think that data reuse is more efficient reuse data more often. Which is cause and which is effect, you can argue, but there is that relationship. The interesting one is concern about trustworthiness. That was not predictive. So people would say, I'm worried that the data that's being shared is not trustworthy, and that they would also still report reusing data. So no connection between concern about trustworthiness and reuse. So it could be that people believe, that they're able to do it. And as well, we had some control variables. Maybe not surprisingly, those who use models or remote sense data were quite a bit more likely to report reuse, because if you're a modeler, you're not getting your own data, you're relying on other people. And of course, if you're relying on things like satellites, you're unlikely to have your own satellite. So again, you're probably more likely to report reuse. But it was also interesting that reuse behavior was higher amongst those who reported using some kind of metadata. And we took that as kind of a proxy for experience. So people who were more experienced with research data management, more likely to use a metadata standard, also more likely to reuse. So we actually separated the two groups, the metadata non-users and the metadata users. And it's interesting that the norms against kind of dropped out, maybe not because it was less important, but just because the subject counts were lower, and so it didn't achieve significance. But amongst the less experienced people, belief in efficiency didn't make a difference. And our hypothesis was that they believed that it might be more efficient, but they didn't really have any firsthand experience with that. Anyway, so we played around with a bit with the data. But taken together, what do these findings suggest that librarians can do if they wanted to promote data sharing and data reuse? So some of these things have come up over and over again during the talk and won't be too much of a surprise. Clearly, educating researchers and students about data management is an important role. It comes through clearly in the experiences of Data1 that people are still, not everyone, but many people are still new to research data management and need help doing it. Clearly a role for advising researchers about data management issues or helping in writing and implementing data management plans. It also seems that there's a real role for providing and supporting better infrastructure for data management. So that was part of the goal of Data1, was to identify these infrastructure needs and to create infrastructure. But that's kind of at the level of the entire science. Doing it at the level of the institution someplace that librarians could help. But looking at data sharing more particularly, it does seem like there's an importance of educating researchers about the value of depositing data in public repositories. So getting the data out from under the desk, off of the USB sticks, into some place where it's, possibly fair, discoverable at least. And to do that, it does seem like people need help in picking repositories. Remember, one of the problems was there isn't a good place to put it. In order to deposit, of course, you need metadata, and metadata, as you can see, was not a skill that most of the researchers were scoring high on. So helping people to create metadata in some kind of standard format, and maybe even running an institutional repository for that long tail data, where it doesn't seem to naturally fit anywhere else, but might still have some value in being captured. And then, of course, in terms of data reuse, it does seem, even though trustworthiness didn't seem to be much of a predictor of reuse, it was definitely a concern. So helping researchers find the data. It should be pointed out that Data1 has 44 repositories, but we heard earlier today that there are thousands of repositories. So Data1 is useful for ecologists. Other researchers in other domains clearly have this problem of trying to search across multiple places to find data. So helping people figure out where to look for data, how to evaluate its quality, how to actually reuse it, that also seems like an important role in supporting reuse. Basically getting at those factors of efficiency and effectiveness. So helping people believe that it's more efficient to actually look for data than creating it themselves. But I also want to put in a plug for a higher level kind of engagement. I really think that people in libraries need to be involved, or perhaps even lead, the development of institutional data management policies. There is a perspective on data management that I think librarians bring to the table that is not otherwise going to be heard. And so I think it's very important to have a role in that. And lastly, and this may be a lot to ask, lobby to have data counted in academic career evaluations. Right now, in most institutions, what counts are publications, journal publications typically, and as a result, data is always getting less attention because it doesn't necessarily count. But in a lot of places, people are starting to do that, and so there's other institutions you can point to as models to have data deposit count and to have papers based on data reuse also count. So that's my takeaway from the 10 years I spent in front of the mast at Data1, and I look forward to the rest of our discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Kevin Crowston. The data provider and service provider model is really fascinating me for a long time. The open access idea came with that, exactly this model of data providers and service providers. Imagine all institutions are going to exist. So if it exists, it can build a repository and make it exist also. Okay. So individually, all institutions can run a repository which is interoperable. So which is interoperable by complying certain standards, common standards. In the open access case, it was proposed this OAI-PMH, Open Archives Initiative, Protocol for Metadata Harvesting. So the data providers will expose metadata to service providers in a structured way. So that is pretty easy for the service providers to harvest metadata periodically and creating a harvester like Data1. I think, have I understood the model correctly? That, yeah. So individually, you can run a defined, institutionally defined repositories, but when you expose metadata, you can expose a set of metadata which is across all the repositories will be able to expose metadata in a structured way. So service providers can only periodically send a query to the individual repositories, harvest metadata structurally, and index it. So you will get a kind of Data1 kind of idea. All the CSIR laboratories in India set up individually defined repositories, and they have a kind of grid and a harvester built on top of it. Department of Science and Technology and Department of Biotechnology laboratories have have their own repositories and a service provider on top of it. We have the Bielefeld academic search engine, which commonly harvests metadata from thousands of repositories across the world. This is a powerful idea, in my opinion, effectively very simple, at once very, very powerful. You can have a small cluster like this. So for example, the institutions can set up an interoperable data repository and then upload their data by exposing the minimum metadata standards available to service providers who can build service very easily. But in open access, this is not actually happening. So the institutions are not able to, for some reasons, they are not able to properly set up repositories and populate them periodically. We would have achieved 100% of open access to all the papers by now, if at least all the science-producing institutions set up repositories and exposed metadata, and we have access to all of them. The human angle actually stops it. The inertia is there. At the end of the day, scientists have to come forward and deposit their paper there. So I'm very happy to see this particular idea. Even recently, I was working for Commonwealth of Learning, where they wanted to create open educational repositories for Pacific islands. Remoteness is a very key, is a problem there in Pacific. So each small state, island state, is going to create a kind of interoperable repository, help the teachers deposit their open educational resources there. At the end of the day, they expose metadata to each other. The repositories can speak each other because they comply to a protocol, common protocol. And you can create an index of all OERs produced in the Pacific region. So teachers from across the Pacific region and other part of the world also can access it. So this is the way sharing, if sharing comes in, to the life of or the workflow of institutions or individual scientists, I think this open access and open data is very much possible. In my opinion, institutions have much more responsibility. To add that, let's have a break from reuse, sharing technically powerful way of sharing. We'll listen to the ethical aspects of data sharing from Dr. Medha Joshi. She is a consultant and information service officer at the National Cancer Grid, Tata Memorial Center, Mumbai. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I just want to give a background. I'm basically a library science person, but I also happen to be on the ethics committees of hospital, Tata Hospital, for more than a decade, and I continue to be an ethics committee member on different hospitals. Having said that, I have reviewed several papers, several research, which had a lot of data, and lot of data that was reused, okay? And when we look at reuse, we have looked at a lot of technology aspect and the need to do and the librarian's role into it. But when we also want to share, we need to look at the ethics of it. When we say ethics, ethics means morally. What is right, what is wrong? What is right for me should be right for others, or may be right for others, may not be for the others as well. It's my perception. So I shall put myself into that shoe and see that if my information is shared, is it okay? If it's okay for others, should be okay for others as well. That's the basic concept. So when we look at ethics, it sits on 4 pillars. One is autonomy. Whatever data, because I will be speaking from biomedical sciences, I'll give a lot of examples from biomedical sciences, and I will also speak basis of ethics, sharing of data based on this. So when we look at this, it is autonomy. That means whosever data is being picked up, stored, and shared, have we had the person consented to it, agreed to it voluntarily? His wishes are respected, or her wishes are respected, can refuse or can withdraw midway. Is that there? Is there a justice? That means every participant has equal right to participate or withdraw from the participate, and equal person will have equal rights of taking the benefits out of the research that happens. For example, we do a lot of huge data. There is a lot of COVID data assembled, and huge repository at the ICMR level also. So people are looking at that data and trying to figure out different aspects of it. So it could be gender-based studies, it could be age-specific studies, it could be comorbidity studies. And when this happens, a lot of data is pulled from that repository. Now, when this happens, was it consented to the participant that your data will be reposited? When pandemic happens, the consent is blanket. But when there are individual researches happen, the consent may not be blanket. So these are the different issues of consent. Another thing is how much trustworthy can this research data be? Why would I want to share? Is it trustworthy? Do I have the trust on the investigator? Do I have the trust on the institution or the agency who's going? So how transparent is this activity is equally important. That's another aspect of ethics. And the third aspect of ethics is whatever benefits come out of it, is it going to be shared? For example, if I do a study for COVID pandemic, where I have data which has told me that for comorbid with this age specific, there can be a recurrence or there can be a long-term impact for which this kind of a treatment or follow-up is essential. This benefit, if I have treated, so Dr. Anant had established that there is an evidence required, and therefore data resharing and reuse is important in medicine. The same taking it forward, now this what I have evidence and found out should go back to the people. I should follow up. How do I go back? If I go back, the anonymity is withdrawn. How do I anonymize then? This is a question, and this is where we need to take it. So privacy, confidentiality is my right. But when there is an issue of this sort, or there is a high content issue, or where there are requirements, leave aside pandemic. Even if I do cancer registries, I will find so many things, a lot of evidences, I need to go back. I need to go back to my participants and say, well, please come, we will do this for you because this is a beneficial thing for you. what happens? So I have to go back. If I use a data from already archived information for cancer, then I have to read or delimit everything and bring back the contacts. Now, yesterday, Dr. Kembavi showed us a huge chart of pandemic data. He said it is anonymized. When we say anonymized, all limits that identify the person should be withdrawn. That means even if it is address, it has to be withdrawn. That is delimitation. When we delimit this type, I cannot go back to the participant for distributing the benefits, that I'm not doing justice. So the whole ethics of data sharing in healthcare is very complicated. It is case-to-case basis, and you need to do a lot of all things. So what happens is, we say the central concern is data has to be used. But how it is going to be used, what are the ethical considerations that have put in? So we often say on ethics committee that if your protocol is well written with all ethical concerns embedded, the data will be good, and when you reuse the data also it will be fine. So different kinds of consents, when you do public studies also you need to do. For example, there was an HIV study that happened when the HIV was very new, and there was a group consent given. Now, when the group consent is given, the difficulty is to identify individual person there and the individual issues that the person can happen. But the consent was given because we wanted participants to come forward to try the anti-HIV drug. So there are such type of issues. So there are a lot of data. Healthcare data needs to be reused, but often there will be a problem. Often, for example, if you say EMR, it is an automatically collected data. So hospitals give you a general consent when you present yourself for the first time. But when the same data is being used for research for a particular purpose, reconsent happens. Often when we find certain changes happening in the research protocol or in the data that has been reused and the analysis has shown you a different thing, you need to go back to the participants and say, we are reconsenting you because this is what we have found. So in healthcare, the anonymization is a part and parcel of your ethical requirement, but taking it and back to the participant for benefits, you have to bring back all the connections. So you cannot completely break away the collections, cannot give the connections to anybody. If you're sharing with, it is multidisciplinary, so when you're sharing with international things or any other body or a third party, first thing is you do an MTA, agreement that you don't share, the confidentiality is maintained. Second, what you do is that if that is done, who is going to be the responsible person for how do you fix the responsibility for breach? That's another thing which we need to look at. So these are some of the things when you share with a third party or you would want to develop into a software. Now from this EMR, the data is picked up for research. So it's connected. How do you de-link this? Because EMR is an automated populated system for patient information. And every information, as Dr. Anand said, belongs to the participant. I am only the custodian. When a third party comes, maybe my responsibility is shared, but still the ownership is not there. So who owns the data in healthcare? That's another question comes. Often there will be research who will say, that, well, the patient's data is completely, it is in the EMR, it is his data. But when I have done for research, I have collected in a specific way, I have done some extra tests, then this is my concept, so data should be with me. That's an arguable thing. We don't know. Like consenting is also a big debate, whether I do a dynamic, whether I do a blanket, whether I do on case-to-case basis. Every time, depending upon what am I going to do. That's it. So when we talk about, we review protocols and COVID, we ask, what is this data? There was a study which talked about age-specific study, what is their need and how do they spend on their health care. A study was done long ago. This was again brought up to say we would want to use certain aspects of these and re-evaluate this analysis. Everything was anonymized, completely delimited, so we could give them and consent. Otherwise, we would have to ask them to go back and re-consent. That is an area. Sometimes you store tissues, and these tissues are given away to your party who have technology of diagnostic things. So you share biological information of a participant. What happens for the leftovers? Do they come back to you or they are destroyed? There was a study long ago when we were not very strong on our ethical researches. When a lot of samples were collected, biospecimens were collected, and normal tissues were also collected. After some time, the person who was funding said, I don't have funds, and I'm not going to support your repository anymore. You cannot keep tissues in normal conditions. There has certain kinds of refrigerators, a temperature is maintained, and you need to use that for appropriate, sir. Now, how do you do this? There's huge hue and cry on ethical aspects because you cannot shrug off. That's when we realize that MT is so very essential when a third party is involved into it. And the management. Otherwise, remember, tissue samples you can collect. What about samples, normal samples? It's a huge information bank which had to go away because there was a breach of contract. So these things happen, and this is where we need to look about. And India specifically, I would say ICMR has strong guidelines on ethical research in human beings, and there are good guidelines for animal research as well. They have special guidelines for COVID studies, they have special guidelines for pediatric studies, they have special guidelines for pandemics that happen, and all these are followed. They have their huge data banks, and we follow these, and their guidelines in absence of regulations do stand in court of law. So one has to follow that. We also, when we share information, we share data, we need to go to a special committee, the central committee under DGHS, who will allow us to share data or biospecimens outside the country. And the percentage of how much is this is all important because we need to protect our participants. And when we say protection, it is not physical, it is social, it is economical, it is psychological, and it is societal, because we don't want our participants to be ostracized for certain type of information that is let out by somebody. So this is what I would want to say, and therefore there are a lot of difficulties in reusing, but we need to look at it very carefully, and every case is case-to-case basis on these 4 principles have to be addressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is a very important aspect. See, in open science, when we talk about the open as a connotation and put all the ideas into the broad basket of open science. See, for example, open access to published papers, which is pretty easy. I publish paper because I want others to read, my peers to read and build upon. There is no such problems of, this ethical aspects or something. It's already published item, so we are going to expand access to other people who have not got access to it. This is what is the primary idea of open access. Then scientists came forward and they told, no, we need reusable rights. I want to put some thousands of or millions of papers into a machine and then do some data mining and analysis. I need special rights for that. They came forward. Then the open access proponents indeed did not like it, because the proponents' main idea was to expand access. Everything will come step by step. First, let's provide access to all the papers to small universities and colleges in developing countries or underdeveloped countries, and we will work out a mechanism for reuse and other things. When you bring the reuse concept into the open access argument, I think everything became a kind of disorganized after that. Now, if publishers want to make their paper reusable, they charge extra in the new APC model. If people, you just want to make the paper open access, only one can read and use, then there is a charge for it. If you want to publish it in under Creative Commons license and all, then they charge it separately. When it comes to open educational resources, the reusable right is built in this keyword. If some material is not having the Creative Commons license, they are not considered open educational resources. But when it comes to open data, from the data collection point of view, I think the ethical considerations, privacy considerations, all that comes in. So there is not going to be a common framework in open science. Wherever we are trying to make open, I think we have to consider that aspect of it, particularly in open data, particularly in medical sciences. We have to consider all these things, which is very, very important. Now I would like to request Dr. Shaily Gandhi. She is a researcher at CEPT University. She is a computer scientist basically, and she has specialization in remote sensing and geographical information systems. And she is applying all these ideas and technology for urban analytics, which is very, very interesting interface. She is going to talk general about the human aspects of reuse. We talked about mission. Through mission, we are going to again talk about the human reuse methods based on her experience, and she will cite examples on the urban analytics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just brief a little more about the kind of work I'm doing. I'm currently heading the geomatics program at CEPT University. And what is geomatics? It's a complete collection of data which is spatial in nature. So every data set what you have has a location attached to it. And it makes a lot of sense. In current world, if you just think about your life, you start your day with Uber, you do so much with Zomato, you are actually giving away so much of data. And this data is being in return analyzed. You're getting recommendation on it that, okay, this could be your next trip. As soon as you get in your car, Google tells you 5 minutes to your office because it knows that you are, daily traveling at this particular time to this particular location. And that's one aspect of research what we are doing, where we look into location-based information and we try to analyze trends. Now, over here, when we talk about data sharing and data reusability, it has a very different aspect. It deals with data sets which are very personal in nature, number one. Number two, it gives away a lot of privacy from your day-to-day life. And that's where we have to come and rethink of how do we protect our individual identity. This is one part. Second part is remote sensing. Remote sensing is also being used by all of us. We all use Google Maps, right? We use it for our own purposes of navigation, but then there are a lot of satellite images, and these satellite images have either open access or they are restricted. All the coarse resolution satellite images, which does not give you very minute details of an area, are open access. But there are images which are capable of giving you information of exactly where the location is, what is there inside the building. Maybe not in much detail, but at least it can give you how many doors and windows are there in the building. And these kind of images are restricted access. So this entire science is evolving in leapfrog way. And that's where, data sharing and reusability is where I would really want to, put in concerns and say, there are places where we should reuse the data. I'll talk about a couple of government policies which have come up. If you all know that they're using massively technology to build urban plans, look into the infrastructure development. Now, these things are being done on data sets. Government wants to open up the data, but they're not sure how correct this data is. Who would go and use it? And those are the regions where ISRO, NRSC, and all the big organizations who are doing day in and day out work with these data sets, giving predictive models, telling you when it's going to rain, when the heat wave is going to hit your city next. So these data sets are still not opened up for the public. We still have some information with us for viewing purpose, and that's good. But as a researcher's point of view, I would say that aggregated data, which does not harm anyone's individual privacy, should be shared instead of reinventing the wheel all the time and trying to create these data sets from a scratch, especially in the urban aspect. If you want to see where the river is flowing, I don't want to sit and digitize all the points, go on the field and recheck it every time. But if I get this information from the past research, I can add on to it, which would add value to the research itself. It would also give me a temporal aspect of how things have changed or evolved over a period of time, and it would save a lot of financials. So this is like reusing the data. Of course, we can keep all the Creative Commons. We can give credits to the people who have really invested in collecting the data. We can also add metadata like saying time frames, when it was created, what was the duration of the survey, how much data was created in that particular project, and reusing it saves all the financials, what were used to collect the data first time. We can do it again, but it would be wiser not to, and it would be wiser to do something beyond that. Now, these are a couple of like global and examples, but I would now bring it down to a student level, where in academia we every year have a lot of students doing research. And these research theses start with the same methodology and they end at the same methodology of data collection, analysis, and then writing a report. Most of the universities have a good practice of storing all these reports in the library in hard copy or soft copy. At our university, we do have a software which helps students, dig out the data, but these reports still remain within the university. They do not go outside the university. The research work done in one university is not shared across, which is again something where we can, think of how can we open up these data sets and how can we share it with other universities. Let's have research which is more inclusive than just being within the silos of the departments or the institutions. So I think these are the key takeaways, what I would say when we talk about data sharing and data reusing. It would be extremely effective if we learn how to do it correctly. And in each sector, you'll have a very different approach. But if all these sectors come up together and say, this is how it would work for us, I think government would be more than happy to support and have individual policies according to sectors. Because anti-SAP is one thing, but if we look at the requirements of today's day, we need much more precise and detailed outlines of data sharing and reusing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for the examples. This is actually the core value of that open that we are talking about. Expanding access to all possible would-be users are the users who have at least access to internet. Should be able to access all the research which are produced in silos. In my opinion, after 20 years of advocating open access to scholarship or scholarly literature in India, at least even the metadata of the projects that are being done in different universities, if that is available, even the original data is not available. That particular data is available with us. That kind of surrogate information, if that is available, also it's okay. Even if you have some privacy issues and other things and all, it's not a problem. At least this metadata accessibility will help, at least to understand who is doing what kind of research, or who is gathering what kind of data and so on. We have lots of institutions. They are working on different kinds of issues. They are producing different varieties of data. So all that should be properly and structurally available. So for that, these metadata and metadata creation, all that matters. She suggested some important metadata elements. I actually took note of it. So we have to devise different metadata schemas for different areas. So we cannot have one common framework to define all these data elements. We have to carefully study. There are disciplinary norms. Handling GIS data will be very, very different. So ecology and GIS has a lot of relations. So ecological data is different. So we have to start working on, analyzing the differences and then respecting these disciplinary norms and create open data infrastructure is very, very important. And thank you very much for your comments. And now we will again move on to the machine readable aspect of the reuse. It's not just human who should be able to understand this data and its interpretation. We have to make the machine understand properly. For that, we have to go one step further than the common metadata framework that we use, that in ontological framework, that links different objects, by asking simple questions, triplets, doublets. So by that way, we can link one record and other record and then make the machine take meaningful decisions. So now we are going to hear from Biswanath Dutta of Indian Statistical Institute, DRTC, about the interface between ontology and data management. Thank you so much.
Thank you once again to the organizers, Professor Salinus and Dr. Satyanarayan sir. So yeah, I start again like in the morning session, I started with a real problem. So here also I would like to start with an issue that actually we have been working since this pandemic started. And before that also, so there are two things. That one, actually, since last several years, I think it's now more than a decade that I have been working in the area of semantic web, the knowledge graph development, ontology, and all these technology, semantic technologies mainly. And I'm also actively, developing a lot of metadata for various purposes, and also the vocabularies for, expressing the data representation. Basically, we are saying data and knowledge representation. And everything in a machine-readable format, everything we are using these semantic technologies, the ontologies. Now, I start with the problem, as I said, see, related to this COVID-19, so when that pandemic started, so we are actually looking for the data everywhere. And I think as all of you are, very much aware of that, the problem of that is that data is everywhere, even though we say that there is no data. That's very wrong in this context of pandemic. Everywhere the data is available. But the problem is that the one problem that everyone, mentioned, that trust, which I am not even considering. I'm not at all looking at that. When I don't have anything, I don't know what to get it. The trust, what I will do with that. So trust comes later, which I will also, touch upon that part. The first thing that what we found that it was really extremely difficult to get really the data which we can make use of it. Because we were trying to build some kind of, intelligent model that so that once we have the actual raw data inside our knowledge base, the graph, that system, the inference engine, the reasoners which used in AI, so it can automatically reason and it give me the data inside automatically by the machine. I don't have to do as a human being because I just develop the model and let it on the system to do it by their own. So the problem started here that when we looked around, that lot of data, were here and there, even now also is there, but difficult thing is that one that we found that the cataloging of the data. And later on, in fact, we have now submitted already, it is under review that, on data catalog, COVID-19 data catalog, and it's huge, right? It's impossible that I cannot claim that we have cataloged all the COVID-19 data that are available on the web. And we actually worked on the publicly available data. It's not that something is proprietary and that because we didn't have any access, obviously. So we worked on that and we already submitted a publication. So that actually is a kind of just only one case I pointed. The another point was that the ontology, as is my core area, there are hundreds of thousands of ontologies have been built. They are mostly inside the research article, or even they are there, the people, the researcher, they don't share. So it is good that at least in Europe and also in the biomedicine area that Stanford University took that effort, and they actually developed like called Bioportal. It's very popular. But then in Europe there are many such portals are there, but in India, I mean in Asia specific or anything, it's very rare. But the thing is that still there was one point was missing, that is metadata. Metadata they were using, but again, it was not enough, but still I would say that they did at least certain thing. So here comes to the point, now I come to this main point, and I will try to finish it very quickly. So I try to answer a couple of questions. So how to promote the use of data, and how can we make the data, trustable? The trust is coming because everybody is talking about that, right? And can we make the data, machine accessible? Because this is very utmost important, because we should make the data machine actionable. Human anyway will be doing, but if we can make this machine actionable, then I think we can really make use of the data. And then another question I will try to answer also, that how to, how the library community can help in, in promoting the reuse of the data or in terms of data curation. So coming to that, so here the problem is that, as I said, this data, cataloging should start from the beginning, as I said in the previous session also. And here the thing is that if you ask the researcher and if you give a big list of, elements to, whatever format it is, let it be even a simple form-based, template, they will run away. So the thing is that we should start with the minimal metadata description, and we have to be also mindful while we do that, while we, design the template, we should remember that if we can take the help of the machine, then probably we can really achieve our goal very quickly compared to that everything living on the human being. So the thing is that the domain expert, the researchers, since they are the experts, so they can give some high-level data, whereas the machine can give the low-level data which we can get it free of cost. So there are many data that we can actually automatically extract with the help of the software, and there are data which we are terming as high-level data that the domain expert, the researcher, should provide. The second thing is that, it should be, as the anchor also was talking about, Dr. Madhan was talking about, the contextual data. This is very important because, when we talk about even the context, you remember we know that Dublin core is very popular, everybody use, but we should look at it and we know that this is a very generic purpose data and it really doesn't help much for the researchers, for the others to reuse. So the idea is that we have to use, more domain-specific metadata beside that generic, generic level of metadata standards like MARC or Dublin core, or even, there are many others such there. But again, when we talk about the domain-specific, we have to be again mindful in terms of to providing something extra data, for example, the provenance data. This data provenance is very, very important, and we often don't give any value to it. Because that provenance data can build the trust. Because, in library science that we know that when we used to evaluate the reference sources, one of the point was that what is the reputation of the publishers? What is the reputation of the author, right? So here also data provenance is very, very important, that who collected data, where it was collected, what time it was collected, all these things. Beside that, you also need to have the more contextual data, in a sense, like in which context the data was collected. What is the case studies? What was the actual problem that for which you collected the data? If we have all this information, including many, I think because of time short, that I'm just skipping some of those points, this will actually help to really promote our data. Then coming to the other point, this machine accessibility, the machine actionable data. If we create simple data and if we store, whether it is in an Excel file or in your RDBMS, that's not going to be really very, very helpful from the machine automation point of view. So what I mean that, because those data becomes very difficult for machine to reuse and really extract something out of it, or even the linking the different connected data, because you see that we are living in the world of networks. Because everything, if you look at it, everything is connected one or the other way. But what happens when we just simply add this metadata as a flat list and we store it in some RDBMS kind of places, the problem is that they don't get linked. They don't get, connected. So we need to build a framework that where data gets connected and they become more structured. So that means we use that word called traversal, data traversal. So we can start from one data point and then we can traverse to the another point. And this is what, with this, that it becomes like a network of data. That means it's a graph of data. And if we have that graph data, as Dr. Madhan was pointing, that we can ask many questions. We can ask many questions that is answer is there, but with this RDBMS or the traditional conventional technologies, we cannot really retrieve such result, and we have that evidence with that work that we did on MOD. It is called MOD, Metadata for Ontology Description and Publication. It is available publicly, and we have also published some sample data. So the thing is that you won't get things answered, that if something you want to know from the data, it won't come so easily. So here the thing is that if we want that machine accessible data, basically the metadata, on metadata you have to work, then it will be automatically done. So we need the graph data solution. We need to think of applying these semantic technologies. Now I come to the another point, and that is, everybody, I mean, since in the last, I'll just finish with that incentiveness. Now, there are, I think, I should make that point. See, now there are journals are also available, which are only for, they are solely for data descriptions, like we do, publish our papers, right, based upon our data and all. But there are some dedicated journals, say, for example, Data in Brief by Elsevier, then Scientific Data by Nature. These are the different such journals are there where you can publish your data. In a sense, you describe your data and publish it, so that you get full credit, you get the citations for the reports on your data. So you publish the data, but you publish based upon your data reports. So this is something is available. I think many of the researchers are not aware about it possibly. So incentive is already there. Publishers, the community have already worked on it. So it is there that we can, we can train people, we can make them aware of it. I think I have, another thing very important is when we are doing this kind of metadata thing, so we don't forget about the versioning, which is a very complex part. And data versioning is one of the important aspects, and it's not so easy to resolve actually. Because every time the researchers collect data and then again improvise, again they refine, again improvise, these are actually the versioning of the same data, and we should find out the way how to link it. Again, for me, I may be too much biased towards the graph because that's my kind of core area, but I would say that this all is something is possible to achieve with this graph data solution, and they are already there, tools and technologies are there. It is just we need the will to work on it. Yeah, I think, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The one point I'm in complete agreement with what Dr. Biswanath was speaking is about this Dublin core framework. Everything we are interoperating two different repositories of different nature using Dublin core kind of minimum set of elements is not going to really help. If you want to provide a kind of comprehensive service with a lot more facets for filtering and other searches, this Dublin core element is not going to be very helpful. So the interoperability standards and protocols should improve. So we cannot always rely on OAI-PMH kind of interoperability protocols. So we have to move beyond this kind of stagnant interoperability protocols for various, to accommodate the specific features of data that we gather is going to be very, very important. That is actually, the important point again is this, he used the word intelligent. So the intelligent data can solve problems very quickly. It's not COVID that tells us that we need collective intelligence to solve a problem. Even before COVID came, 10, 15 years ago, a lot of E. coli infections have been solved by the open science methodology. Quickly we identify the virus and then immediately sequence it and then find medicines for that. Cure has happened in umpteen number of cases because these viruses don't respect boundaries, man-made boundaries or natural boundaries. It spreads very quickly. So this collective viewing, many people view the data, is very, very important. And it should be intelligent data. That should be easily connecting two data sets and then finding a solution. So you have to make the raw data much more intelligent by when you create infrastructure and repositories. So we have to make the data set intelligent so that it can speak to machines, it can speak to human beings in different ways so that people can use it quickly and then solve their problems. I thoroughly enjoyed the panelists' comments on different areas, and I thoroughly enjoyed the demonstration by the keynote speaker. Now I can open the floor for questions from audience, please.
This is a question to Medha. Medha, you talked about, I understand the privacy issue, confidentiality issue when it comes to patient data, but you repeatedly mentioned about the benefits going back to the patients or whatever. See, when these kinds of, whether it is pandemic or any disease, etc., privacy to be protected, but I couldn't understand what you meant by benefits going back, because it is for the progress of science, mankind, policies, etc., isn't it?
See, what happens is many times, even when you do for pandemic data, if you collect information, as I stated about an example about following up geriatric patients who had COVID, and they wanted to follow up on that. Because they realize that when the data gets collected, you're constantly observing the data that is lively being collected, they realize that there are certain things that we need to look. So they retrospectively looked at different data for 6 months for geriatric patients, and they realized that their follow-up was necessary because they had certain kind of lung issues, they had issues of heart, and they had issues of blood pressures as well, which complicated their recovery completely. Now, when you realize this, they need to get into certain kind of another treatment for this. It was essential that once you have realized that they need to come off regular follow-up for hospitals and take new treatments to subside these elongated or long-term effects of COVID recovery, you need to go back to them and tell them that this is necessary and please come back and take certain type of treatment that is being made available to you in the hospitals that you were referred initially. You need to go back to them and tell them you need to give a benefit for the research outcome that has come to you, because it's ultimately for public benefit. It should reach back to them. They are the participants. They participated, therefore the research was conducted. So they have equal stake into the outcomes of that. That is the concept of it.
That is healthcare management.
Yeah.
It's not a data, I mean, the benefit going back to the
so that healthcare
patients
management
because they have shared, they are
healthcare
using their data.
No,
Right? It's a different issue.
Yeah, healthcare management means if you have analyzed a particular group of data and you find that there are certain types of treatment available which need to be given back to those patients who have that kind of, they fit into that criteria, then you need to call the patient back to give them that advanced treatment again, because that's a part of your data analysis which you do collectively for a large number of people.
But your point is that this is a finding of the research, that the research you did on this collection of data has pointed out the need for certain kinds. So it's not that an ordinary doctor looking at this would know something. There's some knowledge that you gained from your interaction with the data, which causes you to say, oh, this subset of people need a specific kind of care. So it is interesting that it's not something that you can just say it's medical care, the doctors will take care of it, because it's one of your own findings.
It is analyzed, obviously when it's analyzed, there is a set of group of different expertise sitting on that analysis part. So there are some clinicians as well who look into all these things. So when they realize that the reanalysis of it, that's how evidence builds in medicine. Okay, so when they analyze and they find out there is something more that can be done to help the people to recover better, then that solution that has come out of the analysis has to go back to the participants. No. Going back to society is it's a larger aspect. That particular group of people who have given their data, then that should be helped.
Even in archives, this is a problem.
Yes.
Old letters and all, we are not able to really release it because of this kind of privacy issue.
Yeah.
Society is okay.
So therefore, there is a charter now, with the charter which says that when you have such collective information, then you can give them a consent, and you can say that this can be shared in terms of larger societal benefits. Then your identity may be revealed. So that type of consent is now given. There is a charter which talks about how consent can be given for larger databases or open databases. So there is this. So this is new. As you progress, and medicine is very effectively, fastly moving forward.
Dr. Sorry, can I add into that further? Yeah, so coming to the same point, actually, yes, you know that as I said that we are working on that COVID-19 ontology, it's called abbreviated as CODO. So what it basically does, it gives, you know, benefit to the even the patient back, because that the model that we have developed, if we get the patient specific, you know, data, and if we are on real time we are using, that actually that whatever analysis happens, the system does based upon the input data, this can help the doctor to treat that patient in a better way. So this is the real time use, is that if we have this kind of, you know, data presented, data collected and, you know, presented in that way, so it can actually benefit to that patient from where I get the data, I can give him back the benefit from there itself. So this is what I think you mean. Of course, it has the larger aspect, like say, for example, this COVID ontology.
Complete society.
Yeah.
Certainly
That was
this
the larger
complete
aspect,
society.
yeah.
So prospectively, what patients will come or people who will come for treatment, they will get that benefit. But who have already done that, gone back home, you need to call them back and give them that.
Any other question, please?
Yeah, I have question for Professor Kevin related to ecological data, and I was also one of the participants in one global database called EJOL, that is related to environmental and ecological conflicts, which is happening across the world, particularly in the developing countries. For example, there are some protests against the new the nuclear power plants in India, and similar other protests for the other ecological disasters. So this kind of data are there. So is there any interoperability issues with your data sets, so that you can make use of that EJOL project data, which is available on ejol.org, and also your data can be utilized by the EJOL people who are using that thing?
So I should be careful to say that my role in Day2 was on the socio-technical side as opposed to the cyber infrastructure side. One of the questions was the motivation for new member nodes to join. And I have to say that it was not always straightforward for a member node to say, yes, we're going to join. Because it's, again, going back to this question about sharing. It's like, you know, in principle, yes, I would like to have my data be more discoverable, but, you know, the kind of modifications I would have to make to our repository to make that happen, you know, it's going to be a lot of work. Is it really worth it? How much use are we going to see? So part of the question would be a technical one. You know, does the repository actually have the metadata in a format where it can be imported by Day2? There are also the questions of, you know, you would have to run some kind of harvester on your server. Is it easy to add? Towards the end of the project, they were targeting a common kind of repository software where they could offer a module to make it easier for people. But each one was a certain amount of work on both sides. So part of it is, to turn the question around, is does your repository want to join Day2? Is it willing to put in the effort in order to see that happen? You know, to implement the software? Does it have the manpower and the technical resources to do that? Because some of the repositories were run by one person in their spare time who was not necessarily very technical. They were often a domain scientist, and so what Day2 was asking was not something that that person could necessarily deliver. On the Day2 side, there were also questions about scope. You know, since it's ecological data, you know, what kind of repositories are in fact invited to join? So I think the answer is everyone would like their data to be more discoverable, but just like with sharing, there's the cost benefit and the technical feasibility. And so all of the questions that the individual researchers said about why they don't share their data apply equally well to the member nodes.
Thank you. I have another question for Shaily. and that is related to, you're talking about Indian government is keen to open up the GIS space, and I heard that they are providing any alternative to GPS. So what is that, and how the researchers can engage in development of different geotagging in the India-oriented new GPS system?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question. I think they're not coming with an alternative, but what government has done very recently in February 2021, till now data collection was not open for any geospatial data sets. You were not allowed to fly drones. You were not allowed to sit and digitize the information because it had a lot of privacy concerns. Government of India, under this Atmanirbhar Bharat program, they've come up with a solution saying that Indian private players, Indian researchers can collect the data, use the data, reuse the data within the Indian boundaries. And that is one very big revolution which has come in this sector. Of course, as I previously also mentioned, that geospatial technology is almost touching everyone's life day in and day out. So it's very difficult to escape from that. But government is really promoting it, and it's also encouraging people to open up the data. Of course, not personal level, aggregated data is being opened up, but this is also very useful, say for your census information, your Survey of India maps, which were not really available in the past. But now, at least you have some access to it. And being at a research organization, we have an upper hand of using these data sets for research work. Same way, all the government bodies also have access to this information, and now slowly and gradually government is also inculcating a culture of cross-department data sharing, which is going to effectively happen with the PM Gati Shakti project, which the government has started panning out, and I think 2025 is the target date, where they wish to have all the departments falling under the government from central to local to have all the data sets up on this portal, and this data would be shared with the government and all the other officers who have access to it. So of course the data would be as open as possible and as close as necessary. Thank you. I think it helps. Yes, there are. So certain regions are restricted, like the airports, then the cities and the villages which are across the borders. Those are restricted areas, and probably those data sets will never open up. But otherwise, a lot of other information across India has opened up in the recent days. Yeah.
Any other question? So shall we conclude? Yeah, thank you very much for the keynote speaker and other panelists for the informative and wonderful presentation and commentaries. Thank you so much.
Thank you all speakers. Thank you Dr. Madhan Muthu for anchoring this session. We had an opportunity to felicitate Professor Kevin Crowston and Dr. Biswanath Dutta in earlier sessions. Now in this session, I request Dr. Muthu to felicitate Dr. Medha Joshi. Thank you. Now I request Dr. Muthu to felicitate Dr. Shaily Gandhi.